Burlington Planning Commission for Tuesday, January 26th. First item on the agenda is the agenda. Any changes to it?
Yes, staff would like to add an agenda item. Where are we? Before commissioner items, just to talk about some anticipated zoning amendments that we're working on that we just want to kind of get out on the table for you and get a heads up around.
David, did you want to do, we could do that, but did you want to do it as part of the director's report?
I certainly can. We're going to kind of tag team on the different topics that we want to cover. So
the zoning amendments are specific to legislative changes that came out of the 2020 legislative session. So
right.
There's kind of a bucket of topics that are all related to that. So we thought it might be nice to have an item.
Okay, so we'll add that between items 7 and 8 to do that.
Okay. Thank you.
Sounds good. Any other changes?
Okay, between 7 and 8.
Yeah. I'm sorry, between 8 and 9.
8 and 9. Okay, great. That works.
All right, then we'll move on to item 2, which is chair's report. And I don't really have anything to report tonight other than to thank everybody for continuing to come to these Zoom meetings. It's a little bit challenging, but it's a lot better than not having the meetings. And I do think we've been getting a lot done. So thank you for continuing to come and participate. Item 3 is the director's report. David.
Yes, thank you. Just kind of touch on a few things here. Staff, the planning staff anyways, continues to focus plus or minus 50% of our time on COVID related response. So following the data, looking for new and innovations, tracking vaccinations and how we can be most effective at getting as many members of our community vaccinated as possible, and managing a city team of contact tracers. We have an agreement with the Vermont Department of Health, provide somewhere between about a dozen city employees from various city departments who are working as contact tracers 3 days a week. So that is, like I said, about half of our time, depending on the week. The FY22 budget process is just getting started. The CAO's office is beginning to pull together the information that we'll be needing to develop a budget, but it's all very conceptual at this point. We won't get into a whole lot of detail around it until after the election in March, but beginning to pull together what are our needs, what are our expectations, that type of thing. Along those lines, we have applied to the Regional Planning Commission for a grant through the UPWP work plan. So funding that will allow us to undertake the revision of the city's impact fee study. So something we talked about, about a year ago, pre-COVID. We were hot and heavy on this. And now that maybe we're seeing a light at the end of the tunnel, we're beginning to look downstream a little bit and what kind of projects will we be looking to undertake. And this one is a pretty high priority to get updated. We have an intern that started working with us this month. Jessica is a dual degree graduate, or will be in the spring, from UMass Amherst in both geography and city and regional planning. And she's going to be doing some research to document residential development patterns across the city that we can use to understand where are opportunities for infill development, and particularly housing opportunities in what is often referred to as the missing middle range. So these are duplexes to maybe quads in terms of size, but smaller multifamily settings, as well as understanding where there are opportunities to do more. And we have been providing some assistance to our friends at DPI as well as others in some active development projects. So some projects that Mary and Scott have been working on, as well as a terminal expansion at the airport.
What's DPI?
Department of Permitting and Inspections.
Ah, yes, yes.
So that's what I have on my list.
Great, thanks. Any questions for David? All right, and I know you said we should hold off on the public forum, but is there anybody in the wings waiting to speak to us?
Yes, I think there does look like there is going to be at least one person who has their hand raised. And I know Sharon Busher is here. I'm guessing she would like to speak as well.
So unless you think we should wait, why don't we start hearing from the people, and if others come in and join, we could hear from them as well.
Yeah, as long as we keep it open, that would be
Yeah.
great.
Okay.
Okay, so I see Amy Magyar. You should be able to speak, Amy.
Thanks so much. Hi, folks. Good evening. It wouldn't be a Tuesday night if I didn't spend a little time with you. I know that tonight we're not discussing short-term rentals, but I felt it's important to just put a little reminder about how the ordinance direction will affect Burlington residents. I won't take up more than just a minute of your time. What I wanted to remind you is the idea that the #1 rule of governing is to do no harm. With the sweeping decision of having very few short-term rental scenarios being open to having a non-primary residence status, there's an enormous chance that you'll be taking away income to the residents of Burlington and causing significant harm. How many? None of us know. And that's the saddest part, because no one truly knows how many our whole units are non-primary residents. So we're either about to do a great deal of harm or little harm. As we've spent the past 4 years seeing, we should not make policy based on hearsay, make policies based on facts. But since the committee isn't open to having us all register to see exactly what the makeup of the short-term community is, I just want to go on record to say, please consider a non-residence option through conditional use to keep the number of short-term rentals in check. Don't turn the lever off completely. Allow it to flow under control and reduce the harm you may do. Thank you. See you next week or 2 weeks from now.
Thank you.
Okay.
And
Sharon Busher, you should be able to talk.
Hi, yes, I unmuted myself. Thank you. I just wanted to say to the Planning Commission, I have reviewed all of the information for your agenda, and the one item that I would really like to speak to, but I'll just share my initial thoughts, but I wouldn't mind maybe being able to add comments after you have a discussion, has to do with the amendment dealing with the shoreline property setback and buffer. And so as I had shared with Scott that when I was on the council, I used to go to the League of Cities and Towns, and I would always gravitate towards those environmental meetings that talked about buffers and protection of our rivers and streams and the lake, and talking about what kinds of buffers we wanted to have, and trying to find if we were consistent with what the state recommended. So this really resonates for me. And I'm glad to see that this is being addressed. One of the things as I read through this, which I don't know everything about this. I like this topic. I care about this topic, but I'm not a planner and I don't know everything there is to know. But I believe that just like there is erosion along the ocean, I think there's erosion along our lakefront also in shoreline. And so I'm concerned about that and how we address that if we're going to move forward with this protection and this buffer and this amendment. So there's a statement that is added language. It is, oh God, sorry, excuse me. It's under 4 requirements. And then it's the last statement in that section. It says for properties with frontage along Lake Champlain or the Winooski River, development shall be located no closer to the shoreline than existing development whenever reasonably possible. And yet I couldn't quite wrap my head around this statement and the statement that talks about when you are looking now at properties and determining the distance, the setback from the shoreline, you don't use the same practice we do on street fronts where you do the average of the properties, surrounding properties around that development. So to me, this statement seemed a little bit in conflict of what earlier statements are, additions or amendments say. And so I wasn't quite sure, I couldn't discern the difference, and I was troubled by that. And so my point is that, to me, I wondered why it hadn't been contemplated that it wouldn't be somewhat of a at least so many feet back from, knowing full well that if the shoreline erodes, that you'd be in violation of that, but I think would be in violation no matter what method we use if the shoreline erodes and you find your property closer and closer to the water's edge. So those are my thoughts. I'm sorry, I don't mean to be stream of consciousness, but it seems like that's what's coming out tonight. So I hope you can understand my point, and if you would allow me to ask questions as you also better define and move this amendment forward, I'd appreciate that. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Sharon. I'm sure there'll be an opportunity. Megan, is there anyone else?
I don't see anybody else that currently has their hand raised to speak.
Okay, good. So we'll keep this open just in case there's anybody who comes in a little bit late, but we'll move on to item 5, which is proposed CDO amendment adaptive reuse definition. And
really quickly, I did just want to note that Eves has joined us, and I did hear back from Emily. She will be logging on within the next few minutes.
okay,
And I heard back from Bruce, and he will not be able to participate.
Okay.
tonight.
okay, good. Thanks for those updates.
All right. So Mary will be presenting the adaptive reuse amendment for you.
Thank you, Megan, and thank you everyone for letting me join your party tonight. It's really unfamiliar territory. Those of us from DPI rarely leave 645 Pine Street, so it's nice to be included. I don't wish to raise any great concern about either one of the items tonight. They're really housekeeping items from our perspective. The adaptive reuse definition is simply a change in the definition to more accurately reflect the federal standards for adaptive reuse. We would not want to interfere with anyone's opportunity to secure any financial or other resources when doing a rehabilitation project, because our ordinance definition does not align with the federal definition. Quite simply, if you're going to rehab a building and you want to utilize an adaptive reuse definition, you have to be changing the use from what it was originally designed or constructed. A good example is something like the Ellie Long Music Center in 40th and Allen that was built for the cavalry to use, was subsequently used by St. Michael's College as a gymnasium. Now, of course, it's a performance space. That's an excellent example of an adaptive reuse project for which they received federal funding to complete. So the first ordinance amendment is specifically just to align with a general understanding and development practice definition of adaptive reuse.
Great, thank you. Any questions for Mary? And the ordinance committee looked at this, I think?
Yes, they did. I remember Eves corrected me for saying cavalry rather than cavalry.
And where was the ordinance committee?
This amendment has been recommended by the Commission's Ordinance Committee.
Great. Any discussion on it? And staff's recommendation is to move this for public hearing.
That's correct. Approve the report and warn a public hearing.
Alex? You're on mute.
Is it time to make a motion and get a
If you would
mug?
like to.
I'd move that we forward this to warn it for a public hearing with the associated report.
Okay, we have a motion by Alex. Is there a second?
Second.
Seconded by Jennifer. Is there any more discussion? See none. All those in favor of the motion, raise your hand or say aye.
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 Any opposed? Okay, that passes. Thank you.
Thank you.
Before we move on to the next one, is it, Megan, has there been anyone who came in for the public forum?
I haven't seen anybody new join.
Okay, then we'll move on to item 6, which is proposed CDO amendment, parking garage illumination standard.
Thank you, Andy. This particular standard keeps popping up as a thorn in our side because the garage illumination standard is now 20 years old. So we were requiring this as part of our development review, but recognizing the standard was outdated. When we were reviewing the Boves garage, it had evolved into a new standard. Now reviewing City Place, it is another standard. It is evolved, not just growing by a change of number, but the direction to which the IESNA standards are going has moved. So our recommendation that we brought before the ordinance committee was simply make a reference to the most recent document by IESNA. And the ordinance committee recommended approval of that.
Okay, any questions of Mary? I actually just have one, and this is less, I guess, with the new language, but one thing that just struck me in the 5A is where it says light levels shall not exceed minimums currently recommended. So you can't be, does that mean you can't be brighter than the minimum requirement?
I think that's out of date, right?
Yes, and that's the way it read before as well, ultimately.
Right, but so that's really my question. It's not really so much with the new language, but we don't want it to be brighter than the minimum brightness required.
Well, the intent of the ordinance was simply to point towards whatever new document that for parking lot standards. I had not caught this language about the minimums, but a reference simply to the most recent document for light standards.
Yeah.
So
We mean
Andy,
that
the
it
short
shouldn't-
answer is yes.
Right. The intent is that you don't exceed the minimums, that the minimums are, we want to encourage the minimum amount of light use wherever possible. So that is the intent, but this amendment kind of highlights the fact that not only is this particular language 20 years old, that whole section of the ordinance is more than 20 years old and is due for a more comprehensive overhaul, but
Yeah, no, I
that's
get,
not on the radar.
I
right
get,
now.
I'm kind of looking at something outside of the proposed change just because it was sitting in front of me. So if it's supposed to be the minimum, that's fine. It just struck me as
Dim.
dim. Well, the minimum, if we want it to be, it's supposed to be at least what's in there. And so it has to be at least the minimum, but it can't be more than that. So it's a pretty precise number of what it has to be.
Yeah.
Okay. That sounds fine. Is there a motion or any further discussion?
I have a comment.
Emily.
I'd love to take up the lighting standards as an issue in the planning commission. I think that I've noticed in a lot of the projects that have been happening, a lot of light bleed off of property onto other properties, which I think is something that we can remedy through the code. And also visually seeing the raw light bulbs. Like I can think the project that happened on Lakeview Terrace, sometimes referred to as the cruise ship, has raw bulbs that you just see from the street. So I think that we could do better in our code, and that the effect of light bleed and the brightness of seeing a raw bulb is actually quite disturbing and makes the urban experience unpleasant. So I would ask that we take this up as an issue.
Good. David, Megan, could you add this to the list for the next executive committee? Just, we could put that on our list of things to talk about.
Certainly, and this is definitely something that's on staff's radar screen or laundry list of to-do items to get to.
Good. Any other discussion? And again, is the recommendation to approve the report and warn for public hearing?
It is.
Is there a motion to that effect? Motion by Alex, I think. Yes. Seconded by Harris. Any further discussion? All those in favor of the motion, raise your hand or say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay. Have a public hearing on this shortly. We'll move on to item, Mary, are you set? Or are you still here for more things?
Get enough, Andy.
Oh, no, you're welcome to stay. I was just going to thank you if you were done.
I'd like to listen a little longer if I may.
Sure. Okay, well, thanks for your input on those last two. So item 7 is proposed CDO amendment, RL boundary at 925 North Ave.
Okay, I'm gonna kick off this one. We also have Cindy White, who is the Parks Director, and Dan Cahill, the Land Steward from the Parks Department, and Rosaire Long, who brought this issue to you at your last meeting, who is from the Elks Lodge at 925 North Avenue. They've all been involved, along with Scott and David, over the past 5 or 6 years in conversations about this property and about options for how to achieve some mutual goals around this property. So they might help us out with some questions if the commission has some. So the proposed amendment that you have is a response to the request that you received from the Elks at your last meeting. It's pretty straightforward. The request is to rezone about 2.4 acres of the parcel from residential low density. I'm sorry, from RCO to residential low density. Currently, the front portion of the property, the first approximately 400 feet of depth of the property, is zoned RL, and that is the portion of the property where most of the developed structures, parking lots that you know of on the Elks property are located. And the remaining parcel runs all the way to the lake's edge behind it. And that's the portion of the parcel that's zoned RCO today. So in your agenda packet, we've provided you with a number of maps that help to illustrate the request that has been forwarded to you by the Elks. The location that is being requested for the new boundary line between these two zoning districts is based on the Elks' work to kind of consider the future use of their property. It's our understanding that they're hoping to continue to operate in this location and are looking for some flexibility for how to utilize their building, parking lot, other structures, potentially with some modest improvements, expansions of lot coverage, so that they can continue to operate in that location. So part of what's driving the request to move the boundary line is to expand the portion of the property that's in RL to not only eliminate the lot coverage nonconformity that exists on the property today, but to give them that room for those modest expansions. They've established the boundary for the request based on a survey, and that was articulated in the letter and the comments that you heard from Rosaire at the last meeting. So the documents that we shared with you also include a map that would not be impacted, is not recommended by staff to be impacted by this requested change, but was relevant for discussion. I know that Dan and others have been involved in conversations about the physical characteristics, the environmental characteristics of the parcel, and its connection to the Burlington bike path, the waterfront, Arms Park, Rock Point, all of these nearby amenities that are high on our list for conservation and recreation access within the city. So we included an excerpt of the natural resource overlay zoning districts for reference. And this is a map that establishes some protective overlays for mapped resources that were identified as part of the open space protection plan. So in this case, you can see on page 15 of the agenda, the area that is in the blue hashed area is part of the natural resource overlay that applies to the back portion of this property. And you can see where the 2.4 acres that are the subject of the request for the rezoning, how they fit within the context of that overlay area. So that overlay applies to much of the property, the portion of the property where that requested change would occur. So yeah, I think that's it. And I don't know if Cindy or Dan wanted to add anything else about the city's kind of interest in this property or this particular request.
I can just go ahead and start, and then Dan, if there's anything else you want to fill in too. So the city's, their, long-term interest for the city is in that back conservation land, primarily the access from the bike path into the diocese property that's been conserved, which then leads to Arms Forest. So there's high value for the city from that access. And the land there's an open meadow. There's existing trails on that. So I think Dan for a number of years has had that on his eye, and but we don't see the front impact. We don't see that what the Elks is looking to do on the front end is impacting what long-term goals for that land. Dan, if you want to, you've been working on it much longer than I have, so if there's anything you want to add to that.
Yeah, just that the request before you tonight resembles scenarios that we've considered with them for a long time, and we don't believe that they have any adverse impacts to the future conservation potential. And the Elks have been really awesome to allow the community in various forms to enjoy that property for a long, long time. And so, as Cindy was saying, it's just a really important property from a variety of levels. And, I'll check there.
Okay, good. Thank you. Any questions or comments from the commission? Harris?
Yeah, thanks for bringing this to us. It's been more than years. I think it's been decades that we've been, identified this property as important. I'm just trying to understand. I have no problem with the zoning change and, helping the Elks in that way to use the property they want to. Is this in exchange for conserving the acres in the back? I'm just wondering how this is working.
Cindy, would you like to speak to that?
Sure, I could touch on that. So, we've had the Elks, Megan met with everybody with both groups, and really the two issues are separated. The Elks is here today for looking for the rezoning of their property. And then what happens with the back end of it is a separate discussion. So it's not, they're not, my understanding, but Rosier's here, it's like seen as an exchange. It's two separate discussions. It kind of got really convoluted when it tried to be this intertwining effort. So I think it's a one standalone request from the Elks is the rezoning of this one portion. But we as the city will continue working with the Elks for future discussions on the rest of the property. Right now, I don't think we're on the same page. Transparently, we're not necessarily on the same page as pricing. So there's longer discussions that have to be made as far as future access ownership easements, whatever that future is for the back part of the property.
And just to save from Kim jumping into the conversation, but it would be inappropriate for us to tie a zoning change to some sort of quid pro quo
Right.
as well.
Yeah. And that was mostly, I was hoping Cindy would just kind of talk to the bigger picture of the conversations. I know that, and Dan alluded to this too, that there have been a number of conversations about this parcel of land over the years. And when we were first approached at the staff level with this request before it came to the commission, that was one of the questions that we clarified early on in the process, is that, you know, in order for the Elks to continue to be viable in their current location, you know, they do need to address the lot coverage nonconformity to give them some flexibility for, you know, and Rosaire's here, he can speak to it, but he's mentioned, you know, expanding, you know, to add a cooler for to support their kitchen, or other kind of modest improvements to the property that they would otherwise be limited from doing today. I think that you know, when we look at how this fits within the context of the city's, you know, planning efforts, really trying to encourage and maintain that development closer to North Avenue is, you know, what our plan really talks about, and maintaining the back portion of that property in a conservation district, regardless of how the conversation moves in terms of ownership and partnership with the city, is really the way that we were looking at this from a zoning perspective.
Yeah, and I hear what you're saying about not wanting to do a quid pro quo, but on the other hand, it kind of happens all the time. I mean, I'm thinking of the diocese property, for example, and working out the development plan and having some conservation areas. I just am afraid it might be a missed opportunity. Not that there has to be anything necessarily nailed down right now, but at least, you know, a memorandum of understanding going forward that we're going to have discussions, or right of first refusal if they ever do decide to sell, or, you know, I mean, something like that. I don't know.
So yeah, Harris, some of those options that you've discussed, when I met with Cindy and Rosaire early on, you know, I kind of specifically said to them that I was separating myself from those conversations. You know, I was looking at this purely from the perspective of considering the land use question. So any of those other options would really be up to kind of Cindy and her team and the city attorney's office to consider.
Harris, are you set?
What's that?
Are you all set?
Yeah.
Okay. Anyone else?
I'm hoping that
Alex?
someone can explain to me in English, what is it we're asking to be considered here? Like we're downzoning a part of a parcel that looks to be 3/4 natural area from RCO to RL. You know, I understand that people need to change the way that they use their properties, and, you know, things aren't frozen, but it's just, it seems a little odd, like why we're considering this. Shouldn't this go to the DRB for one thing? And can, you know, it just seems, well, please enlighten me.
So in plain speak, yes, we're talking about switching a couple of acres of this property from the RCO district to a low density residential district. As far as going to the DRB, I'm not sure what avenue they would have to go to the DRB. The existing development that's on the parcel is already, and either Rosaire or Scott could maybe correct me on this, I think is pretty far in excess of the allowable lot coverage that is the limit in the RL zoning district. So at this point, I think that the Elks would really be limited to their existing lot coverage, working within their existing lot coverage for any kind of improvements or changes they would be interested in making on the property. So that is a limitation for them. I think, you know, from the perspective of I guess maybe the value question you're asking about why would we move this boundary? Again, I think from a planning perspective, our goal is to kind of encourage and facilitate more utilization of the properties that are immediately adjacent to North Avenue. We really want to encourage their vitality, and even in some cases might want to see them more intensively used and developed. And moving this boundary line can certainly help facilitate that. It gives more, lot area to work with in the RL zoning district. That said, I think knowing that there are the natural resource overlays that are independent of the underlying zoning of the district that provide some additional protection for the mapped natural resources that are truly of value for us to conserve, gives us some protection to help create that balance. So unless Scott or David want to add anything to that, I don't know if that helps.
It does. Thanks, Megan.
Okay.
No, I think that says it well, that, the specific resources that we would be seeking to protect are protected under the natural resource overlay. And this gives them more flexibility in lot coverage on the front portion of the property, given the low lot coverage limitation within RL.
Okay, thanks.
Andy, I've seen Rosaire put his hand up a couple of times.
Yeah,
He
I
might
just
have
saw that
on
as
this.
well. Rosaire, did you want to add something?
Thank you very much, commissioners. Appreciate being able to speak with you and for you taking up this request. Just to maybe the first thing I should say is the discussions that we've had so far really didn't hinge on quid pro quo. The discussions came to a halt after the survey was done, and it was discovered that we were non-conforming the way we were. But even more than that, if we had to add on something as simple as a cooler or freezer, which we need because we do a lot of food banquets and receptions and stuff like that, or even now the shelter that we have up there that we use with it's like about a one-car garage that's for storage, but it's even a little smaller than that. If we need to expand that a little bit to get a little more storage, but the shelter to get more people under cover from the rain, we wouldn't even be able to do that. It'd be a non-starter to even put a request in. So the line that we came up with off the survey would barely let us it would do away with non-conforming. It would barely let us do some little thing. It definitely isn't the kind of extra coverage that would allow a big addition or great expansion or something like that. It just more or less to stay viable with the kinds of things. We want to do more outside things with picnic type of events in the back for members, and that was why we wanted to make sure that before we considered any kind of a transfer of the parcel in the back, we needed to make sure that our hands weren't tied. That's what stopped our discussions more than anything else. I don't think the word quid pro quo ever came into discussions. Now, off the RCO, moving that line, like they said, is 2.4. It's about 338 feet. It's not really material in a scheme of things, because it leaves about 13 acres of RCO all the way to the lake. And what's even more important that is of interest to the city is right off the bike path, as you take about 3 or 4, maybe 5 steps upward, you're in a very large field that would be, unbelievable how many different things the city could plan for that, where even the rest of the, most of the rest of the arms force, you don't have that kind of access into a nice open field and something else. So, there is that kind of interest to be able to have a more of a recreation area. And those woods that most of the property, almost all the 13 acres except for that field, are the kinds of woods where there are paths that people have been using for walking through, and I suspect biking with probably mountain bikes, but they've been doing all that use in there, and obviously they've been doing it on private property. We've not gone in there and put up any signs of no trespassing or anything like that. So moving the line, it just allows us to, in the future, to look at anything that we might have to put on in the terms of a small addition. But also it opens up the possibility that we can be able to finalize a deal to get the 13 acres of addition to the arms force. All that 13 acres, a good part of it actually butts up to park department land now, and part of it down towards the bike path is up against diocese land, all of which is in the force, the arms force. And so when if it comes to a transfer to the city, we're not even talking about a subdivision. It's just a boundary adjustment that would be done through deeding. So that's kind of where we're at and what is behind all of this at this point. Being able to move that line is just would open up our ability to be able to finish some negotiations. Cindy, did that sound about right? Yeah.
Good, great. Thanks a lot, Rosaire. That was a good explanation. Anybody else? Harris?
Yeah, thank you, Rosaire. That explains things well. And it does sound like the, conservation efforts are still kind of being considered and potentially moving forward. And that makes me feel better about this. And again, I have no problem with the zoning changes up front by the road. I think that makes sense. Honestly, even though again we do it all the time, it is a little problematic doing the zoning change just on one property. It's supposed to be more looking at the at more than one to make a change, but we do it all the time.
That was my question, Harris.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, we do, I know we address this question often when we're talking about map changes. So we wouldn't consider something like this to be spot zoning because we're not creating kind of a new area of a zoning district that applies kind of on its own at standalone. We're making adjustments to an existing boundary between two districts. So, and Kim can correct me if she sees anything different, but we wouldn't consider something like this to be spot zoning.
And I might note one other thing. Like I mentioned, a lot of that forest back there has trails and all that going through. Where this line is moving to is not actually taking away any of those trails. It's going to be a little bit before those kinds of trails appear on the land. And the other thing I wanted to mention, the Elks have been out there and have owned that property since 1956. And it's been a property that people have enjoyed going down through there, but not wide open for what you call real public use. This will actually be able to turn it into public use the way it should be.
Great, thank you. Jennifer, did you raise your hand?
I did. I just wanted to speak to that last point. I really appreciate the conversation about the parks and the conservation of the open land, which I think is really, really critical. And I every day appreciate the outdoor space and the park space that we have in Burlington, especially now. So I'm really glad those conversations are happening. But I also just wanted to talk about, as a new North End resident, I see how much that building is in use all the time, even during this difficult period. And, like it was the site for, assembling meals and gift packages for seniors before Christmas. And there's all sorts of stuff that happens on that property. It is a private space, but I do see a lot of evidence and have personally been able to take advantage of public things that are happening on that space. So it's an important asset in the neighborhood. I think it is for the city as well. There's not a ton of places like that. And so definitely want to just highlight that if this enables them to provide more access of that kind, I think those resources are really important in Burlington, and would absolutely support this change to enable greater access and use, not just for the Elks members themselves, but when they make that property available to other events and groups and activities. So really appreciate that resource in our neighborhood.
Great. Anybody else? So here, the staff recommendation again is to approve the report and warn for public hearing.
That's correct.
Is there a motion? Somebody?
Come on, Eves.
I move that we, what am I moving? That we
You're
move
moving
this
to approve the report and warn for a public hearing.
So moved.
That's the
Forgot
one.
where we're at.
Motion by Jennifer. Is there a
I'll
second?
second.
Seconded by Emily. Is there any more discussion? All right, seeing none, all those in favor, raise your hand or say aye. Any opposed? Then that passes, and we'll have a public hearing coming up in a little bit on this one. Thanks to everyone who came for this. It was discussion was really good and helpful.
Commissioners, for your consideration, I very much appreciate it. May I be excused from the meeting now?
You may be, Rosaire. Thanks for coming, though.
Thank you very much.
Take care. So we'll move on to item 8, which is proposed CDO amendment, shoreline property setback and buffer. And who's
That's
going
gonna
to
take this one on.
Okay.
Megan, I thought I'd let you do it. Just joking.
You've already got a question in the queue.
So yeah, so there's two pieces to this amendment. The quick background, the very quick background is Conservation Board had initiated this amendment following years of seeing shoreline redevelopment projects. So the city currently has a lakeshore buffer, lakeshore and river corridor buffer, and it extends 250 feet wide inland from the 95-foot elevation along the lakeshore. So we have that in place already. We also have a lakeshore setback, which is different from the buffer. A setback is what it sounds like. It's a minimum distance for development to be. Development within the 250-foot wide buffer is allowable, subject to Conservation Board review and certain standards. So that's the quick background. So two pieces to this proposed amendment. One is an alternative front yard setback for waterfront properties. And what's driving that is, you probably already know this, but in the residential districts, the front yard setback is based on the average of your neighboring property. And that works pretty well in uniform neighborhoods. But properties along the lakeshore are a different animal because of the variability in the lakeshore and variability in the placement of structures along the lakeshore. In addition, most of these homes are set pretty far back from the street. So we lose that street edge that's common elsewhere in the city. So the problem that has arisen a number of times before the Conservation Board is that applying that average setback based on your neighbors has actually pushed redevelopment and additions closer to the lakeshore than existing development, which is contrary to the provision of, gee, we want to protect the lakeshore. So the solution here is fairly simple, and that's to establish an alternative setback for the front yard. And it's pretty similar to what we already have for the side yard and rear yard setback. For the side yard setback, for example, it's 10% of the lot width, but in no case can it be more than 20 feet. So what we're proposing here is a maximum of 50 feet. So that seems that distance seems to alleviate most or all potential instances of that average pushing development closer to the lakeshore. So that's all along a long way of saying that this alternative setback should preclude the problem of the average pushing development closer to the lakeshore. The second piece of this is a little bit more involved, but still not all that complicated. As I mentioned, we have a buffer zone along the lakeshore, and this is a new piece to that buffer standard. And presently, redevelopment in the city along the lakeshore is pretty similar to the standard under the state's Lakeshore Protection Act. And that basically means you can't make existing conditions worse, right? The standards are great for so-called greenfield development, but pretty much all the Burlington shoreline is already developed. So redevelopment, basically you can't make conditions worse. So the Conservation Board said, well, we'd like to have an opportunity to improve things a little bit along the lakeshore. And so the proposed amendment here adds some language for development over a certain threshold, and we use 400 square feet. That's the same bar for stormwater review to kick in. But development of more than 400 square feet triggers the need for a no-mow zone along the lakeshore of a size proportionate to the proposed development. There are some standards in place that would preclude being forced to have a no-mow zone along the entirety of your property. It does have a minimum width dimension. I will point something out that I think we need to add to the language here. There is no upper limit on the width of the no-mow zone, and I think we should have one. It's not that hard to imagine a scenario with a larger scale redevelopment to have a no-mow zone consume most or all of the green space on the property, and that's not the intent here. But I think we can put an upper limit of 50 feet on that.
Scott, do you have proposed language for that?
For the upper limit?
Yeah, what you're just talking about now.
Well, I think I looked at the state standards, and it's not so cut and dry. They have sort of a graduated system. I think 50 feet makes sense as an outer limit. So at least 15 feet wide, up to 50 feet wide. And that would enable us to have that continuous vegetative buffer along the shoreline. And that's the intent.
Okay. And were you just looking for that one, just so everybody's on the same page? It's on page 23 of our packet in, I guess it's subsection 4.1. Do I have
Yeah,
that right?
I was gonna ask if that was the section where you would add that, Scott.
That's the section. So that paragraph there establishes the parameters for the no-mow zone and cites the at least 15 feet wide. And we need to add a phrase or sentence there to put an outer limit of 50 feet in width there.
Okay, great. I didn't mean to cut you off if you're all, but are you all set?
You know, that's really the overview. We're looking to take an incremental step towards improving shoreline conditions, both for water quality and habitat.
Okay, great, thanks. Questions, Alex? I saw you were starting.
Thank you. Scott, thank you for that presentation. I'm just, I don't understand the need for an upper limit. Like, are you concerned about snakes?
I would be.
Well, it says at least 15. Well, the wording right now, Alex, says it needs to be at least 15 feet wide and of a size equivalent to the new development. So there's no upper limit there. So that's why I'm saying it's not that hard to imagine for a larger scale redevelopment to have the no-mow zone suddenly be most or all of the green space on the lot. And that's not really the intent here. The intent is to have a buffer along the lakeshore. Maybe 50 feet isn't the right number. That is a common number. That's the threshold used in the state for wetland buffers. As I mentioned, the state's standard for shorelines isn't that cut and dry. It's a more complicated graduated system.
But Scott, are you really talking about that kind of like the last line there, that in no event shall a no mow zone be required to extend along more than 80% of a shoreline's property or exceed 50 feet wide?
Basically, no.
Right? So if I wanted to create a 100-foot wide no mow zone, I could do that. But what we're trying to include in the ordinance is that the ordinance will not require it to be more than 50 feet wide.
Right. And I think that that could be particularly applicable if you have a long and narrow lot, kind of like the one we were just looking at with Elks. If you could imagine, you know, a sizable development going onto that property where to achieve what they're intending here, like an equivalent area in no mow zone to what the development is, it could cause that to extend, you know, in a really significant way into like deep into the lot.
Yeah, inland, and a number of the residential properties on the waterfront are relatively long and skinny.
Yeah.
Megan, Sharon at the beginning during the public forum said she'd like to have an opportunity to speak to this. I don't know if she still wants to, but
She should be able to if she would like to.
okay. Sharon, did you want to say anything further on this?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for recognizing me again. The other information that I'm still not clear on is that last sentence after the paragraph that you're discussing that talks about properties with frontage not, let me see. Development shall be located no closer to the shoreline than existing development whenever reasonably possible. So does that give people a pass from these requirements? I'm just trying to understand that.
No, it doesn't. This is that second paragraph, Sharon, is basically a site design standard that relates a little bit to the 50-foot front yard setback alternative. And what we want here, what the punchline here is that we want to see redevelopment move away from the lakeshore when possible.
And that's what I would like to see too, but I wasn't understanding how this accomplished that. If indeed a development was closer than 50 feet, excuse me, they'd still be able to be there, right? Excuse me.
50 feet for what? I'm sorry, I don't follow.
If a development was already closer to the shoreline. Oh, I see. Never mind. I understand. Thank you. I didn't read it correctly. Thank you.
Okay.
Sharon, you all set?
Yeah, I think so. Besides choking to death, yes, I think I'm okay.
Get a cup of water, and thanks for chiming in.
Yeah, no, once again, it's consistent with what Scott said, and I was just hoping that there was enough in place to not allow a developer to. So if a building, I'm sorry, Andy, can I ask one more question?
Sure.
So if a building was torn down, they could redevelop that in the same footprint, once again, still being closer to the shoreline than we really wanted them to, but they're still allowed to do that. Is that true?
That is correct. The existing degree of nonconformity could be retained.
Okay. All right. Then that's why you've got the statement, whenever reasonably possible. So if they could pull it back, that's the intent of that statement. Is that true?
That is the intent of that statement, but I would also point out in that case, because we do see tear downs and rebuilds, a new home would trigger the need for a no-mow zone along the waterfront.
Oh, okay. So that's an added protection. Okay,
Yep.
great. Thank you. Now I really do understand. Thank you very much, Scott and Andy. I appreciate that.
Great. Thanks, Sharon. Anybody else? Harris?
Yeah, thanks, Scott. I like the way this is going. I also agree with having an upper limit of 50 feet or whatever it is. If someone wants to mow their lawn and put out a picnic table or something, should be able to buy the house. But I don't know if this is getting too much into the details, but I don't know if no mow should be defined because I worry about invasive plants a lot. And once you stop mowing, a lot of cases that's just going to be coming up. So it might be good to have a qualifier in there saying except for invasives management or something where you're knocking something back, or I don't know.
That came up during Conservation Board review, Harris. And invasive species management is already permissible, even if it involves clearing.
Even if it's in a no-mow zone?
We don't currently have no-mow zone language here, but the feeling was that we already specifically enable that practice. So we didn't need to re-enable it in here. I suppose it wouldn't hurt to say except for invasive species management, but again, that did come up and it's already specifically enabled, and they didn't feel a need to re-enable it here.
And if I remember that maybe this was the conversation with the ordinance committee, is that it's not that that area can't ever be mowed. It might be brush hogged once a season or something like that in order to keep down woody and herbaceous vegetation, but it's not to be mowed like a lawn. I think there was some wiggle room in our conversation about that. Maybe it needs to be codified somehow.
Yeah, I was going
I
to
think
ask
that might get to your concern, Harris.
if that's the intent, should that be incorporated in the language somehow?
I think the question, Scott, would be, is that characterized someplace in what ANR's guidance says about a no-mow zone?
Yeah, I think you need to categorize what you define as a no-mow in order to allow what you're talking about. I think that's the piece that's missing from this, because no-mow does imply no-mow.
Yeah.
So I think you need to give a further definition of what that really means in terms of by no-mow, this shall mean that, but shall not mean that on an annual basis this cannot be brush hogged in order to whatever.
Yeah, and I think those are both pretty easily achievable and commonplace practice for these. The annual brush hogging, as David mentions, and invasive species management. And that's pretty easy to address here without overcomplicating it.
I think that'd probably be wise to do. Just if that's what the intent is, might as well make it clear so that way it doesn't get confusing later for people. Great. Anybody else? So again, staff recommendation here was to approve the bylaw amendment report and warn for the public hearing. I guess the one caveat is to amend the language as we've discussed, which I think Scott, Megan, you have enough direction on the amendment to the language, if that's what the commission wants to do.
Yeah, I think just a clarifying question for me is, does the commission want to include Scott's recommendation about the 50-foot maximum for the no-mow? Okay, I'm seeing some nods.
I think the answer is yes. So
okay,
if someone wants to, we could start with a motion to approve the report and warn for public hearing with those two sets of amendments. One is was it the maximum of 50 feet of the no-mow zone, and the clarification of what we mean by no-mow zones.
So motion to accept the report, warn for public hearing with the changes of the 50 feet and the clarification of what no-mow means.
Okay. So that motion by Emily, is there a second?
Second.
Second by Jennifer. Any more discussion on this? And again, Scott, you have enough clarity on what we're asking that you do that you recommended to us to do?
Yeah, I think it's pretty basic, pretty clear.
Okay, good. All right. See no more discussion. All those in favor of the motion, please raise your hand or say aye. Any opposed? Good. That passed.
And this is a favorite topic, I think, for the commission. You'll really appreciate this one, is accessory dwelling units. And Megan was going to take this.
Sorry about that. My Zoom froze. My husband is also on a planning commission meeting right now, so I think our internet is not keeping up. Yes, so sounds like David introduced the purpose of what we're talking about here is to identify some changes to Burlington zoning ordinance that might need to be made as a result of the statutory changes. So a couple of key things related to accessory dwelling units are that the state statute has redefined what an accessory dwelling unit is. And the gist of that is that they have tried to remove some of the level of specificity from that definition so that there's more flexibility for the creation of accessory dwelling units. So specifically, the state removed any kind of definition about the number of bedrooms or type of dwelling unit. And does not include in its definition anything that would limit occupancy, the number of people within an accessory dwelling unit beyond what a building code might require. So we need to remove those elements from our definition of an accessory dwelling unit, both in Article 5 and in our definitions in Article 13. Basically saying that an accessory dwelling unit is just a dwelling unit that's subordinate to the principal home. Removing our efficiency or one bedroom. And you may remember that we had a 2 adult occupant limit for within the ADU. The other change that the state made to accessory dwelling units is to kind of adopt our approach that we took about saying that an accessory dwelling unit can be 30% of the size of the primary home or have another kind of upper limit to the size. They chose 900 square feet instead of 800 square feet, which is what we did. So we also need to amend the language of our ordinance to be in compliance with that, to allow that extra 100 square feet of the upper size. So those are the two things that we need to change it within our zoning ordinance to be in compliance with those statutory changes. I think one other thing that's just interesting to note is that the state is also trying to address, kind of how covenants and deeds work specific to ADUs. And, they worked on a piece of this bill and are following up on it this session to try to remove barriers that HOAs or condo associations might, where they might preclude a home from having an accessory dwelling unit where it would otherwise be allowed in a local zoning ordinance. So that's not something we need to address, but it's kind of a related piece of what they did with ADUs.
So I'll take on the next one. It has to do with existing small lots. Again, the statute was amended slightly to specifically list. So this is the provision in statute that says that if you have an existing lot, that a municipality can determine whether or not lots below a certain size can be developed under their zoning or not. The state changed some of the parameters about their size and particularly whether or not those lots are able to connect to municipal water and sewer. So in the Burlington ordinance, section 5.2.1 talks about existing small lots. Lot of record existing as of 1973 can be developed if it's not less than 4,000 square feet in area and a minimum width and depth of dimension of 40 feet. Well, the statute has the same language about 1/8 of an acre, which is about 4,000 square feet. It talks about a minimum depth or width of 40 feet, not and, which is something that we need to correct in our ordinance. And also that these lots, municipal, if they're not served by and able to connect to a municipal water and sewer service. So our ordinance needs a couple of small changes in order to catch up to what the statute provides for.
Okay.
Next one.
The next one's a fun one, and one where we're looking for your feedback on how you would like us to incorporate. Scott, did you want to describe the conditional use piece?
Sure. So the statute's been revised as it pertains to conditional use review. And what the new section says, it says a multi-unit dwelling project consisting of four or fewer units located in a district allowing multi-unit dwellings may not be denied solely due to an undue adverse effect on the character of the area affected. So, right, the tried and true character of the area. So this is trying to limit the applicability of that in housing development. So David, Megan, Kim, and I talked about this earlier today and see at least 3 potential ways to address this that we'd like to get your take on. So the first one, we can simply add this language to our conditional use criteria, simply clarifying under our character of the area criterion in conditional use that an adverse finding under that can't result in permit denial. Second option, we could go a little bit further and simply say that the character of the area criterion doesn't apply to such projects. Or I guess option 2B here is something similar to what we used to have, is to simply deem that such developments are deemed in compliance with that criterion. Let's see if I can speak. The third option, the home run option, perhaps, depending on your viewpoint, is to simply make duplexes a permitted use in the low density residential zone and multifamily dwellings a permitted use in the institutional zone. I point out those 2 zones because duplexes, the only zone where a duplex is conditional is RL, and then in the institutional zone, multifamily is conditional. So again, we're talking about conditional use criteria here. So those are basically the three general options. Looking for a little bit of input from you as to which route we should take.
Are there other conditions for duplexes in RL besides the character of the neighborhood? Or potential?
Well, it's funny because the express intent of the RL, if you read that in the CDO, says it's intended for single family homes and duplexes. Right, so we're already saying it's consistent with the intent. But the answer to your question, Emily, is that duplexes have to be reviewed under every one of the conditional use criteria, as well as site plan and design review.
Yeah, there are 6 total criteria under our conditional use review standards, so they would have to be reviewed under all of the others still.
And to be fair, that it would be nearly impossible for a duplex to trigger any one of those criteria because it is such a marginal impact from a single family home.
In a way, this is I think this is probably a really good step, but probably a very big step to take. And it might be better to have our ordinance committee take a deeper look at it, come back to us with the recommendation, which I imagine I know what that recommendation would be, But I think in terms of just the process and trying to, put it out there for, there's a good possibility that there'll be a lot of people that don't quite understand that will want to weigh in, and so we could start that process early, and maybe get ahead of it. But I think on a weighty issue like this, it may make sense to have our ordinance committee look at it.
Sure.
It doesn't have to be a long look necessarily, but
Yeah, I think that could give an opportunity to get into more details about what each of these options that staff has proposed could mean, and bring that recommendation to all of you.
but I'll just say we have a duplex in the RL. That I don't really see that it has much impact on the neighborhood one way or another. And off and on, we've used it as a duplex. Sometimes we've used it as a single family. Sometimes we've used it as a duplex, and I know a lot of our neighbors have the same kind of thing. So it's pretty seamless in our neighborhood. So to me, it's not a big issue, and it might make it easier. But Alex?
Since I'm no longer on ordinance committee, I'm all for kicking this question to ordinance, and maybe you can figure. Does anybody else troubled by the what the heck is the definition of character of the area? If the character of the area is a slum, and you propose to build a spiffy glass and steel house, like, it's going to change that character. So good luck, ordinance.
I do think, my understanding of what the change to state statute was about is that oftentimes, like, character of the area can be a very ill-defined, very open to interpretation kind of standard. It does say specifically, that it has to, meet the character as described by the zoning district, the purpose of the zoning district. But I think that oftentimes people can wrestle with what does that actually mean? And I think that this is an intent to kind of encourage communities to think a little bit more specifically about what are the character defining features in a certain area within a certain zoning district, and to have actual objective standards that help them review projects to say, yes, this does fit the character, or no, it doesn't fit. So by starting with the kind of impact that this sort of ambiguous standard could have on, the addition of 1 or 2 housing units within an existing development, they're trying to kind of remove that barrier and that confusion, and encourage that more objective look. So,
well, and to your point, Alex, depending on the purpose of the zoning district, sometimes it is to protect the existing character and pattern of that district, but sometimes it's to change it. So your slum example, where you're looking to your strip commercial area where you want to see more intense, more urban development to get rid of that strip commercial district, you don't want to protect the character of the area. You want to change it. So it's important that it is well defined and well described.
Jennifer?
Yeah, I think that language is problematic for a lot of reasons, the character of the neighborhood, because the interpretation of that can really also mean certain types of people or certain types of activities in a neighborhood, and has often been used to exclude people from neighborhoods. So I am actually pretty uncomfortable with that language in general, and would love to see us look at our codes and get rid of it. And I think patterns maybe is a better word, because that speaks more to the form that we think is important, but I'm not even sure about that. So I really hope we take a good hard look at this and get rid of those characterizations. I think they're really not helpful right now.
Bring it to ordinance. We'll take it on.
Let's consider this with ordinance then.
The
I don't think we
last
need a
one in
vote.
the list has to do with cannabis. So you were probably all familiar that last year the legislature passed Act 164, which is the legalization of cannabis sales in a variety of different forms. Just last week, or maybe it was the week before, the city council passed a resolution putting an item on the ballot, March ballot before the voters about allowing for retail cannabis in Burlington. So one of the provisions of this statute allows for municipalities to opt in if they want to allow for retail sales of cannabis in their community. There are a number of other ways that cannabis is going to be regulated and managed depending on kind of what it is. Is it, again, is it a retail product? Is it an industrial product? Is it an agricultural product? You know, all the various stages that cannabis would go through from, you know, from the farm, if you will, to the end user. So the council had an interest in putting this ballot before the voters. This is something that we will want to take up in some form over the course of the next year or so. But I caution a little bit because most of the guardrails for how cannabis is going to be allowed to be manufactured and sold in a retail setting remains to be seen. A statewide cannabis control board is being formed, and they will ultimately define or go through rulemaking to define how those different activities will actually function. So a cultivator, a product manufacturer, a retailer, a wholesaler, and then the integrated license is somebody who does all of those things. So we'll want to follow this process, understand what the rulemaking looks like and what kind of implications it may have to Burlington. We may want to engage in that conversation, but we should be aware that at some point going forward, we may need to make changes in our ordinance in order to address cannabis in one form or another. I will make a note that at least for me, the way I look at this as a starting point, whether or not you are testing, wholesaling, cultivating, manufacturing, or selling cannabis really shouldn't be treated any different than any other product that you are manufacturing, wholesaling, retailing. Because the state's going to have fairly clear guidelines about how that takes place. And for our purposes, it's retail sales, much in the way that we provide for medical cannabis to take place in Burlington as a pharmacy. It functions the same way as a pharmacy. So that's kind of my initial take on how closely we would want to regulate this kind of activity. There are going to be lots of opinions about this for sure. And there are some, but not a lot, of kind of unique aspects to cannabis and kind of what are the impacts of cannabis to an adjacent property in the neighborhood. You know, there's a lot of anecdote, that's for sure. But when it comes to what's the real impact, well, odor probably is a key one. If you have some sort of a manufacturing facility, and that's easily addressed through some sort of a performance standard, perhaps. So we put that on your radar screen, something that we'll be monitoring and looking perhaps to take up over the course of the coming year.
David, that's interesting. I mean, I could see it being regulated through licenses. I could see it, you know, the general ordinances, some of the nuisance ordinances, perhaps, you know, who knows what, but I just don't see it in zoning, how it's a zoning issue. And so that'll be interesting
it's like
if it comes
liquor.
up for us.
Or farming.
Right. But this is, as David was saying, this is really not, you know, as a product in terms of zoning, as I look at it, it's not different than it fits into one of those categories. It's either permitted, conditional, or not, but I don't see it being a standalone, something unique beyond what we're already doing. So it'll be interesting to keep an eye on it and see if it really does have a zoning impact.
David just said it's like liquor. So,
Yeah, but
And there is a state liquor control board. There is a local liquor control board that manages the licensure of folks who sell alcohol products. Same, going to be a similar kind of process for people who are selling cannabis. But again, that's dealing with the nuances of how that actual functions, with inside the building. From a retail sales or retail sales, we don't regulate. The kind of the parallel to this is we don't regulate adult uses any differently than any other use. Some communities do, and they are really particular about it. But our approach here in Burlington has always been, if you've got a bookstore, we're not telling you what kind of books you can and cannot sell. There's a whole nother kind of community standard and tolerance that may or may not support adult books. But as far as zoning is concerned, we don't regulate it.
we actually tried a bunch of years ago. And
Tried a couple of times, yeah.
yeah, and one of the
There
times
has been an effort to try.
there has been an effort, and one of the times it was set up where you couldn't be so many feet from a school or from a church or from a this or from a that. And then people who lived in like 2 small pockets of the city came to us and said, why are you creating a red light district where we live? And it was just really, really small pockets. And I said, oops. So you're right, it never really went anywhere.
there's the character of the neighborhood.
Yeah.
That was.
The other thing I was just going to add to this discussion is that, in the last few years, we've also passed a number of amendments that actually seek to further eliminate some of the remaining nuances that we have between various types of uses. So the food and beverage one is always one that comes to mind. We used to have separate definitions and standards in our use table for wineries, breweries, cideries, you name it. And we kind of condensed a whole number of food and beverage processing uses into one use and said they're basically the same from the perspective of land use. So I think, yeah, I agree with Andy. It'll be interesting to see what implications, if any, this has on our zoning ordinance, but I'm also kind of leaning in the direction David suggested that it may not be much.
Stay tuned.
Any other questions? Any other highlights? All right, so
I'm sure it'll be another fun legislative session this year. So
it sounds
we'll
like
see what
it,
else comes up.
and look forward to more of these updates to hear what's going to come our way. With that, we'll move on to item 9, which are commissioner items. We have our next meeting on February 9th. And I
That is
believe
a
it's
joint meeting.
and the joint meeting, is it going to be at 6:45 or 6:30?
It's going to be at 6:30. I think the counselor that had the conflict that was leading to the 6:45 meetings doesn't have that conflict anymore. So we should be back to our normal time, and apologies for the confusion on tonight's start time.
Okay. Any other commissioner items or committee reports? Alex?
I have a question, Andy, for you as chair.
Sure.
Just about the issue we're discussing of short-term rentals. Like, do you have an end game for when we'll decide on this, or is that not appropriate? That I don't want to get it wrong either, but we can think about.
We have been working through at the last meeting. We were working through both the specific code, but all that is getting revised per our discussion. So some of it will live in code or in the zoning, and most of it will live in the minimum housing code. And I mean, hopefully for our next meeting, Scott and Megan will have that drafted in that way, and we'll go through the review of that. And soon as people are ready, as soon as we think the language is right, we could move it to, well, our piece of it to public hearing. And then the council will take up both the zoning and the minimum housing code aspect of it. So I think our goal is to recommend to the council a minimum housing code to go along with it, but that's we won't be able to do any more than just send it off to them. But I do want to focus on the specific language as opposed to talking about the concepts, because I think the specific language helps get us closer to an end game and get it done. And we've had a lot of the broad discussions. So good question, but hopefully we could focus on the language at the next one. And when, I think we're also at the point where we like to do things by consensus, but if we come up against some stumbling blocks, we can start to do, I also call them interim votes on specific items to see, do we want to do it this way or that way, and keep moving, and then we vote on the thing as a whole. So that's more or less what my plan is. If that sounds okay with folks.
On that issue, I'm wondering if it might be good to be able to talk about a timeline for people who are doing short-term rentals about when, if they're no longer going to be allowed, or I guess it's never been allowed, it's not a currently legal use, maybe a time frame for people who are doing short-term rentals to know when there's going to start to be enforcement action, so that those apartments can be listed for rent. And I know a lot of apartments in Burlington are on the June to June timetable for rentals. So I don't know if we want to be mindful about that, about trying to match a time frame so that people who are doing it can list currently Airbnb apartments to be available in June. Just thought.
Yeah, I mean,
One of
hopefully, Megan.
I was just going to say that, it's a little bit difficult for us to crystal ball when the kind of process of discussing what amendments we might want to make and adopting them might actually happen. But one of the things that I know Scott has mentioned before is that, the city is really envisioning that there would be about a year kind of grace period in some form before we would start active enforcement. So I agree with you. I think that that's important to make sure that there's information about when that would happen. But that's something that we've always envisioned being part of the implementation of whatever changes actually come to fruition.
I think it would be good to communicate that to the people who are coming to the meetings, that if the intention is that there's going to be a year grace period or something like that, that is really, I think, generous and gives people a good amount of time to make other arrangements and plans. And it might ease some people's hostility about the issue, to know that they're going to have a year to change their plans.
Okay, that'll be good to get information out there. Anyone else? All right, then we'll close commission reports and move to item 10, which are minutes and communications. Is there a motion to approve accept the communications and approve the minutes? By Alex. Is there a second? By Harris. Any discussion? See none. All those in favor of the motion, raise your hand or say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, that passes. So now we're on to item 11, adjournment. Woohoo. Is there a
So
motion
moved.
to adjourn?
So moved.
By Harris, seconded by Emily. All those in favor of adjournment, say aye or raise hand.
Aye.
We stand adjourned.